September 23, 1952, eastern Kentucky, 780 feet below the surface. A mining crew led by foreman James Cordell was widening a passage in the deepest industrial shaft ever excavated in that part of the country when a pickaxe drove through a section of thin stone and the wall collapsed inward. What opened behind it was not a cave, not a natural void in the limestone, not a geological anomaly produced by water or pressure or the slow, patient violence of tectonic movement. The chamber behind that collapsed wall was 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, its ceiling arched in a perfect dome reaching 15 feet at the center. The floor was paved with fitted stone showing tool marks, the deliberate marks of tools held by deliberate hands working toward a deliberate purpose. And arranged in two perfect rows on that fitted stone floor, facing eastward with the precision of a ritual that someone had planned and executed with great care, were 12 skeletal remains. The shortest measured 8 feet 4 inches. The tallest stretched 9 feet 7. Beside each skeleton lay objects that should not have existed in Kentucky earth. Bronze artifacts showing zero corrosion despite centuries of burial in damp limestone. Stone tablets carved entirely in cuneiform, the written language of ancient Mesopotamia, the writing system of the Sumerians, a civilization that history places firmly in the Middle East thousands of years before any acknowledged contact with the American continent. Foreman Cordell's crew stood frozen in their lamplight and looked at what they had found. Within 72 hours, the entire shaft was sealed with 40 feet of reinforced concrete. The engineering logs vanished. The miners signed non-disclosure agreements under threat of blacklisting and litigation. The mining company issued a statement citing routine safety procedures. And what those men saw at 780 feet on September 23, 1952, has been locked underground ever since. This is what they found, and this is the story of how it was buried. The shaft did not appear overnight. It was the product of 18 months of intensive engineering work at a cost exceeding $2 million, an extraordinary capital commitment in 1952, the kind of investment that only made sense if the projected returns were substantial enough to justify it. The mining company's engineers had spent a full decade surveying the coal seams of eastern Kentucky before selecting this specific site. Mapping profitable deposits with the obsessive precision of men whose careers and reputations depended on being right about where the coal was. This shaft was supposed to unlock a fortune. Eastern Kentucky in the early 1950s was coal country in the most complete sense of that phrase. The entire regional economy, employment, infrastructure, political relationships, community identity was organized around the extraction of coal from the ancient deposits beneath those hills. Mining companies wielded the kind of authority in that landscape that comes from being the only significant source of stable income for entire communities. They owned the land. They owned the equipment. They owned the political relationships that determined what happened in state capitals. And they operated with the particular confidence of institutions that have never had a serious reason to doubt their own authority. The shaft descended deeper than any previous Kentucky mining operation. The crews that worked it rotated through 12-hour shifts in the cold dark at the bottom of the earth, pickaxes striking coal, loaders filling cars that rumbled toward the surface in the darkness. By late September, the deepest level had reached nearly 800 feet. And that is when things began to change. The temperature at the lowest levels dropped in ways the engineers had not predicted from their geological surveys. The air took on a quality that the miners struggled to describe when they talked about it later, a stillness, a heaviness, something that did not behave the way air at the bottom of a coal shaft was supposed to behave. Miners working the deepest passages reported peculiar echoes, sound moving through the rock in patterns suggesting vast open spaces somewhere beyond the walls they were cutting through, spaces that the geological surveys had not indicated were there, spaces that the accumulated experience of men who had spent their working lives underground told them were not natural. On September 23, they found out what was making those echoes. The wall gave way at mid-morning. Foreman James Cordell's crew was widening a passage at the deepest level when a pickaxe drove through a section of stone that was thinner than it should have been, and the wall collapsed inward. The sound it made, the particular way it gave way, told the experienced men immediately that there was open space on the other side. What they were looking at through their lamps was not what any of them had encountered in years of underground work. The chamber was rectangular, precisely rectangular in a way that limestone does not produce through any natural process. 30 feet long, 20 feet wide. The ceiling arched overhead in a dome that reached 15 feet at the center, not the irregular vault of a natural cave, but a geometrically consistent arch that spoke of mathematical knowledge and deliberate construction. The floor stopped them completely. It was paved, fitted stone blocks laid with enough precision that the joints between them were tight, and even after however many centuries that chamber had been sealed, tool marks were visible on the surface, the specific patterns left by specific tools used in a specific way by workers who knew what they were doing and did it well. Someone had built this room. Someone had built it carefully and sealed it completely, and it had been waiting 800 feet below the hills of eastern Kentucky for a mining crew with a pickaxe to find it. And then there were the skeletons. 12 of them arranged in 2 rows on that fitted stone floor, all of them oriented to face eastward, not scattered, not disrupted, not deposited hastily in the way that mass burial events produce their characteristic disorder. Arranged, deliberately positioned with the precision of a mortuary ritual carried out by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The shortest was 8 feet 4 inches. The tallest was 9 feet 7. Their bone density was visible even in death. The frames and musculature of individuals whose physical scale suggested a strength and presence that the men standing over them, experienced underground workers accustomed to physical hardship, found genuinely difficult to absorb. Beside each skeleton lay objects. Bronze shields bearing carved designs of robed figures constructing stone buildings. Bronze vessels, bowls, containers, objects whose specific purpose was not immediately clear, but whose quality of manufacture was. These objects showed zero corrosion, not minimal corrosion, zero. Despite having spent centuries in damp limestone surrounded by the particular chemistry of a sealed underground environment that should have oxidized bronze into unrecognizable green degradation, the metal was intact. And the stone tablets, covered entirely in cuneiform script, undeniably, unmistakably cuneiform, the wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay or carved into stone that constituted the written language of ancient Mesopotamia, the writing system developed by the Sumerians in what is now Iraq, a writing system that history places firmly in the Middle East and absolutely nowhere near the coal seams of eastern Kentucky. James Cordell radioed the surface and reported carefully that they had broken into an unusual chamber. The supervisors arrived within 2 hours. The supervisors who arrived at the chamber that afternoon came prepared in a way that suggested they had thought about this kind of situation before. They brought cameras, measuring instruments, collection bags. They were not panicking. They were not standing frozen the way the mining crew had stood frozen. They moved through the chamber with the organized efficiency of people executing a procedure rather than responding to a surprise. They photographed everything, multiple angles of each skeleton, the stone tablets from multiple distances, the bronze objects individually and in their positional relationship to the skeletons beside them. They recorded bone lengths and skull dimensions. They noted the exact spacing of the cuneiform inscriptions across each tablet. They collected samples, bone fragments, tablet pieces, bronze shavings, and catalogued them in a collection log that would later list 23 separate items recovered from the chamber. One supervisor produced a leather journal and sketched the chamber layout with meticulous precision, the 2 rows of skeletons, the position of each artifact, the chamber's exact dimensions marked to the inch, the arched ceiling's height at the center and at the walls. This documentation was thorough. It was professional. It was exactly the kind of careful primary record that should have formed the foundation of a published scientific account of the most significant archaeological discovery in American history. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the crew was ordered out. They were brought to a surface office. Papers were placed on the table in front of them. The mining company's lawyer was present, and he explained the terms of what they were being asked to sign without inflection and without haste, in the manner of a man who had done this before or had prepared carefully for doing it now. The non-disclosure agreements were explicit. You will not discuss what you saw. You will not describe the chamber. You will not mention the skeletons or any artifacts. Violation would result in immediate termination and blacklisting across all Kentucky mining operations. Civil litigation would follow. Each miner received 2 months of additional wages, $50 per man, a significant sum in 1952, equivalent to several weeks of ordinary income, enough to feed a family for months. One miner, Robert Hayes, later recalled thinking it was hush money. He was right, he signed anyway, so did the others. They were sent home and told never to return to that shaft. Not all of the documentation that day went into the supervisor's collection bags. One member of the crew had been keeping a private record throughout his time at the shaft. Thomas Ashford worked as a secondary surveyor, responsible for recording shaft dimensions and passage stability, a role that had trained him to document what he observed with systematic precision. After the supervisors finished their collection and ordered the crew to the surface, after the non-disclosure agreements were signed and the wages were paid, Ashford went home and wrote in his journal. The entry is dated September 23, 1952. He wrote that they had broken through to a sealed chamber at 780 feet down, that 12 skeletons measuring 8 to 9 feet tall had been arranged inside it facing east, that bronze objects showing no corrosion were present beside each skeleton, that stone tablets bore writing the supervisor had identified as cuneiform, that cuneiform was Sumerian, and that the company had brought a lawyer and paid them all to sign papers saying they had found nothing. He wrote that he knew what he had seen, that he had measured it, that the bones were real and the writing was real and that someone would want to know. He wrote that he was keeping the entry hidden. And if something happened to him, he hoped someone would find it and understand. Ashford hid the journal in a safety deposit box. It stayed there for 50 years. It was discovered in 2003 when his daughter was settling his estate after his death. By that time, the shaft had been sealed for half a century. The mining company no longer existed as an independent entity. The supervisor who had sketched the chamber layout in his leather journal had taken his knowledge to the grave. The engineer who had overseen the sealing had done the same. But the journal remained. Handwritten, dated, precise, written by a trained surveyor in the immediate aftermath of what he had witnessed, before memory could soften or distort or rearrange the details. Written by a man who understood that what he had seen would be taken away and who made a deliberate choice to leave something behind that could not be taken. Thomas Ashford's journal was not the only documentation that escaped the supervisor's collection effort. Robert Hayes, the miner who had recognized the hush money for what it was and signed anyway, had managed to photograph one of the cuneiform tablets before the supervisors confiscated all equipment. The photograph was taken with a small personal camera by candlelight in the chamber's dim illumination. It was blurry. The conditions were far from ideal for documentation. But the script was unmistakable. Hayes kept the photograph in his wallet for decades. He showed it to his daughter in 1978 and swore her to secrecy. She kept it hidden until his death in 1995. Only then did she attempt to contact a researcher. The photograph survived 70 years of concealment. When examined by specialists in ancient languages, none disputed what they were looking at. The tablet visible in the image bears genuine cuneiform characters consistent with Sumerian script from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The photograph itself was analyzed for authenticity. The paper and chemical composition are consistent with 1952 film stock. The image is not a modern fabrication. It is documentation of a discovery made 7 decades ago by a miner who understood that something needed to survive the institutional response that was already forming around him. Then there were the letters. A third miner named Frank Morrison had written to his brother in the years following the discovery. Morrison had been present on September 23rd and had spent 3 more years at the shaft working upper levels. Between 1952 and 1955, he sent letters that described what he had seen with a precision and internal consistency that could not be attributed to embellishment or the distortion of memory across retelling. One letter stated directly he knew he could not talk about it openly, but he needed someone to know the truth. What they had found down there was not coal, it was not natural, it was built, and it was built by people who should not have been there. The company knew, that was why they sealed it, that was why they paid them. Morrison's letters were discovered in 2001 by a historian researching Kentucky mining history. The historian submitted them to an academic journal focused on Appalachian studies. The journal's editorial board rejected the submission without peer review. The rejection letter described the content as too speculative and the source material as anecdotal. When the historian contacted board members directly, the responses were consistent in their vagueness. The content did not meet the publication's standards. The evidence was too challenging to institutional consensus. It was easier to reject than to investigate. The most significant piece of evidence that survived the 1952 cover-up did not come from the miners. It came from the mining company itself. An internal memo dated October 3, 1952, 10 days after the discovery, was addressed to the company's board of directors. It was discovered decades later in a historian's private archive. How it got there never fully explained. One of those archival accidents that institutional information management occasionally fails to prevent. The memo outlined the situation with clinical corporate precision. The chamber had been found. Its contents had been documented. The discovery was, in the memo's language, incompatible with current historical understanding and would invite unwanted regulatory and academic scrutiny. The board's decision followed. Seal the shaft with reinforced concrete, retrieve all documentation, secure witness agreements, issue a public statement attributing the sealing to standard safety procedures. The memo concluded with a cost-benefit analysis that reduces the burial of the most significant archaeological discovery in American history to a line item. The financial impact of the containment approach was significant. A fully operational mining shaft capable of extracting coal worth millions over its productive lifetime was being deliberately abandoned. The company was walking away from decades of potential revenue and pouring concrete into the deepest penetration of the earth ever achieved in Kentucky coal mining history. They calculated that cost, and they paid it. Because the alternative, public disclosure, and institutional investigation would be, in the memo's words, far more costly. The document used a specific phrase that has stayed with everyone who has read it since. Containment protocols. Not safety procedures, not standard operations, containment protocols, the language of people who understood that what was in that chamber was not a mining hazard. It was a historical fact, and historical facts that cannot be controlled must be contained. The memo referenced institutional complications and theological sensitivities alongside the regulatory concerns. Someone at the board level understood the implications clearly enough to name them. If ancient Sumerians had reached North America, if they had built chambers and been buried with ceremonial precision in the limestone hills of eastern Kentucky, then the foundational narratives of American history, of religious tradition, of academic authority were not simply incomplete. They were wrong. Better to seal the shaft, better to pour the concrete, better to pay the cost of one lost mine than to open a door that could never be closed again. The cuneiform tablets are the piece of the 1952 discovery that demands the most careful attention, because cuneiform is not an ambiguous script. It is not a collection of marks that untrained eyes might mistake for writing. It is not a decorative pattern that resembles an ancient language if you look at it in a certain way in a certain light. Cuneiform is one of the most thoroughly documented writing systems in the history of archaeology. Thousands of tablets bearing cuneiform have been excavated from sites across Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. The script has been studied continuously by specialists since the 19th century. Its characters, their forms, their combinations, the conventions of their use are understood in exhaustive detail. When the supervisor who arrived at the Kentucky chamber identified what was on the stone tablets as cuneiform, he was not guessing. When the specialists who later examined Robert Hayes's blurry candlelit photograph confirmed that the visible characters were consistent with Sumerian script from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, they were not speculating. What was carved into those tablets was a specific writing system from a specific civilization from a specific part of the world. And that civilization, the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia, is not supposed to have had any contact with North America. The standard historical account places the first meaningful contact between Old World civilizations and the American continent in 1492. Before that date, the two hemispheres are understood to have developed entirely independently of each other. Any physical evidence suggesting otherwise does not simply complicate the timeline, it demolishes it. It requires an entirely different account of human movement, maritime capability, and civilizational reach across thousands of years of history that academia has spent 2 centuries constructing. Linguists who have examined the Hargrove photographs and similar cuneiform finds from North American sites point to similarities with tablets from the Ur-III period, roughly 2100 to 2000 BCE, suggesting the tablets in the Kentucky chamber may have been produced by or for individuals connected to one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in human history at its height. The bronze objects beside each skeleton reinforce this interpretation. Sumerian metallurgy in the 3rd millennium BCE produced bronze of extraordinary quality. The zero corrosion of the Kentucky objects is consistent with the specific alloy compositions that Sumerian craftsmen developed, compositions that have proven remarkably resistant to oxidation even in humid underground environments over very long periods of time. What was in that chamber was not a collection of random, anomalous objects. It was a coherent assemblage, burial goods, written records, ceremonial objects, consistent with the mortuary practices of a specific and identifiable ancient civilization. A civilization that was not supposed to be anywhere near Kentucky. By 1953, the shaft was entombed. 40 feet of reinforced concrete had been poured into its upper section, blocking access to every lower level permanently and irreversibly. The surface structure was demolished. The land was fenced. Company property signs were posted. The site faded from public awareness with the quiet efficiency of something that had been designed to fade. What had been the deepest industrial excavation in eastern Kentucky became a patch of overgrown ground surrounded by trees marked only by faded warning signs that few people ever stopped to read. The engineering logs that had documented 18 months of shaft operations, thousands of pages recording daily progress, geological observations, equipment specifications, the accumulated knowledge of the deepest dig in that region's history were collected from the site office, sealed in boxes marked proprietary, and loaded onto trucks. No record exists of where those trucks went. Mining historians who later attempted to access the company's archives found only gaps in the most relevant sections, the lowest shaft levels, the most recent entries, the detailed geological surveys of the deepest passages, all missing. The company claimed standard record disposal. The timing of that disposal, within days of September 23, 1952, was not standard anything. The 23 samples listed in the collection log dated September 23, the bone fragments, tablet pieces, and bronze shavings documented as being sent to an external laboratory for analysis, generated no published results. No institution has any record of receiving those samples. The external laboratory was never identified. The analysis was never published. The samples entered an institutional void and did not come out. What remains is what slipped through. Thomas Ashford's journal, hidden in a safety deposit box for 50 years by a surveyor who understood that institutions could confiscate physical evidence but could not reach every copy of everything. Robert Hayes's photograph, carried in a wallet for decades by a man who knew what he had signed and signed anyway, and kept one piece of proof regardless. Frank Morrison's letters to his brother, written between 1952 and 1955 by someone who needed at least one other person to know the truth. And the internal company memo with its clinical language about containment protocols and institutional complications and theological sensitivities. The document in which the people who made the decision to seal the shaft explained to themselves exactly why they were doing it. Think about what that memo reveals. A mining company in 1952 walked away from a fully operational shaft capable of generating millions in coal revenue over its productive lifetime. They poured concrete into the deepest hole they had ever dug. They destroyed records, secured witnesses, and issued a false public statement. They calculated the financial cost of all of this and determined it was worth paying. Not because the chamber was dangerous, not because of any genuine safety concern, because what was inside, it was incompatible with current historical understanding. That phrase appears in the memo. Incompatible with current historical understanding. The company's board of directors in 1952 looked at cuneiform tablets and 9-foot skeletons and bronze objects with zero corrosion in a sealed chamber 780 feet below eastern Kentucky, and they understood, with enough clarity to write it down in a document addressed to their board, exactly what they were sitting on. And they decided the cost of the truth was higher than the cost of the concrete. Somewhere beneath a patch of overgrown ground in eastern Kentucky, behind 40 feet of reinforced concrete that has been hardening for over 70 years, 12 skeletons still lie in their 2 rows facing east. The bronze shields are still beside them. The stone tablets are still there with their cuneiform script, saying whatever they were saying to whoever was meant to read them, saying it still, in the specific patient silence of things that have been sealed away underground and have nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but wait. The shaft is still there, sealed, fenced, fading back into the landscape that the mining company's concrete and demolition crews tried to return it to in 1953. The journal is still there, or its contents are, preserved in the copies that Ashford's daughter made when she found it in 2003, distributed now in ways that cannot be recalled the way physical specimens can be recalled. The photograph is still there, blurry, candlelit, unmistakably showing cuneiform script on a stone tablet in a Kentucky coal mine in 1952. The memo is still there, with its containment protocols, with its institutional complications, with its theological sensitivities, with its cold corporate calculation of exactly how much truth costs when you have decided not to pay for it. They sealed the shaft. They could not seal everything. And what they could not seal keeps asking the same question that James Cordell's crew was asking when they stood frozen in their lamplight on September 23, 1952, looking at 12 enormous skeletons and stone tablets covered in the writing of a civilization that had no business being anywhere near eastern Kentucky. How is Sumerian in a Kentucky mine? That question has been underground for 70 years. It is still waiting for an answer.